Before I will explain why there is a drive toward a World Bank, I will have to discuss briefly another question, that is, why is there a drive toward world government? Because the drive toward a World Bank can be best understood as an intermediate step in the underlying drive toward world government. So let me begin then with a definition of what government is. A government is a compulsory territorial monopolist of ultimate decision-making or of jurisdiction, and this is implied in this first part of the definition. It is a compulsory territorial monopolist of taxation. That is, a government is the ultimate arbiter and for the inhabitants of a given territory regarding what is and what is not just. And it can then determine unilaterally, without requiring the consent of those who seek justice or arbitration, the price that these justice seekers must pay to the government for providing this very service. Now, except for some so-called public choice economists such as James Buchanan, it should be obvious that such an extraordinary institution cannot arise naturally as the outcome of voluntary contractual agreements among individual property owners. For no one would agree to a deal that entitled someone else once and for all to determine whether or not one was truly the owner of one's own property. And certainly no one would agree to a deal that entitled this monopoly judge with the power to impose taxes on oneself. Rather, an institution such as government would normally and from the outset be regarded as an illegitimate and indeed criminal protection racket. And as a protection racket, this institution would tend to be brought down quickly. It is possible for such an extraordinary institution to survive for any length of time only if and insofar as this institution succeeds in instilling in the protected public a myth that is a false yet nonetheless generally held and because of this effective belief. In order to make the public accept it and not to resist it, the protection racket must be made to believe the public that without it, without the monopoly of jurisdiction and taxation, in a so-called state of nature, constant warfare among individuals and individual property owners would exist. And I have called this belief in the necessity of a monopolist in order to create peace, this is the Hobbesian myth, and identified it as the most powerful and most effective and widespread myth of the modern world. Now, it is not my intention here to further analyze this myth. Rather, I want to analyze and develop the consequences that follow from the fact that this view about the nature of government is actually believed by people, and hence a protection racket is regarded as a legitimate institution, that is, as a government, instead of a protection racket. Now, first, if a government is generally held to be necessary for the establishment of internal peace, then it follows that the agents of this institution will take advantage of their monopoly. They will increase taxes and they will reinterpret the law to their own advantage. The price of justice will rise and the quality of justice will permanently fall. Or, to put it differently, government has indeed an interest in making peace among its subjects, that is, to prevent one subject from warring against another or robbing another subject, but it has this interest only so as to rob all of its subjects more successfully itself. Now, however, instead of concentrating on the internal consequences of government, I want to concentrate my attention on the external consequences, that is, on its foreign rather than on its domestic policy. And in this regard, two observations are of fundamental importance. On the one hand, by virtue of its power to define and interpret the law and to tax, every government is faced with the risk of exit. Its subjects might leave the territory over which a government's authority extends in order to avoid its taxation and its perversions of the law. And every such exit, of course, implies a loss of potential revenue to the government, whereas any population increase promises potentially higher tax revenue. And on the other hand, at least at the outset, there exist many competing governments, each one faced with the threat of exit, but each one also equipped with the power to tax. That is, of externalizing the cost of territorial expansion and of foreign aggression onto its own subject population. Instead of having to pay the price of aggression out of its own pocket, it can make other people pay for its being aggressive. Because of this, it can be then predicted that competing states will come into conflict with one another over population, and the competition between governments is, however, different from the competition between private firms. In any given territory, only one monopolist of jurisdiction and taxation can exist. There cannot be free competition in ripping off other people. Because of this, the competition between governments tends to be a violent competition and tends to result in interstate wars and be eliminative. That is to say, by means of war, one state expands its territory at the expense of another one, and the number of remaining states will progressively fall. There is then a tendency toward political centralization set in motion, which would come, theoretically speaking, only to a halt once there is a single world government, when the threat of exit is, of course, completely eliminated. Now, we can even be more specific regarding the tendency toward political concentration in raising the following question. Which states will tend to be victorious in interstate warfare? Now, victory or defeat depends, of course, on many factors, but in the long run, the decisive factor for this is the relative amount of economic resources at a government's disposal. Now, in taxing and in regulating, governments, of course, do not contribute to the creation of economic wealth. In fact, they parasitically draw on existing wealth. However, governments can influence the amount of existing wealth negatively. That is to say, other things being equal, the lower the tax and regulation burden imposed by a government on its domestic economy, the larger its population tends to grow because of internal reasons as well as of immigration factors, and the larger the amount of domestically produced wealth on which this government can draw in its conflicts with neighboring states. That is, states which tax and regulate their domestic economies comparatively little, in the European sense liberal states, tend to defeat and expand their territories at the expense of less liberal ones. This explains, for instance, why during the 19th century Great Britain became the dominant imperial power, and why in the 20th century this role has fallen to the United States. And even more specifically, it explains why the United States, internally one of the more liberal states, has conducted the most aggressive foreign policy, while the Soviet Union, for instance, which is entirely illiberal domestic policies, has engaged in a comparatively speaking peaceful and cautious foreign policy. The reason is quite simple. The US knew that it can militarily beat any other state, and hence it is aggressive. Whereas the Soviet Union knew that it was bound to lose a military confrontation with any state of substantial size unless it would win the war within a few days or weeks. Now let me turn to the next question, that is the relationship of government and money. In these circles, and Walter Block spoke about this already to a certain extent, and it is hardly necessary to explain in great detail